Why do some fighting axes have curved edges, while some fighting axes have straight edges? Hi there folks, Matt Easton of Schola Gladiatoria. Now Boom, a commenter under one of my recent videos talking about maces, noticed that these two were sitting in the background, as they often do in many of my videos. This, incidentally, is from Thor's Forge, a beautiful axe sent to me by Tord, which is a faithful replica of a so-called Dane axe, probably better, more correctly known as a great axe, actually, from the late Viking era, or Norman era, if you want to call it that, and 1066, as featured on the Bayeux Tapestry. And we've got a bunch of these surviving in museums. We're very lucky to have some in London because, in case you didn't know, London, my hometown, was subjected to various attacks by the Vikings over the years. We love those Scandinavians. We're still full of Scandinavians, actually, London. Wherever you go, you seem to meet them. But anyway, they turned up, particularly in the 900s, and attacked London a number of times. And in one of those attempts, or at least one of those attempts, I think probably happened more than once, they tried to pull down London Bridge. London Bridge is falling down, that's right. I don't think it's got anything to do with the Vikings, but it might do. London Bridge used to be a large wooden structure which had buildings across it and was fortified during the age of Viking raids. And it was a way of controlling the entry to the Port of London. Very clever bit of fortification, and the Vikings realised that, or more probably correctly known as the Norse, so a mixture of Norwegians and Danes mostly, and they came with their ships and they threw grappling hooks up and tied ropes around the bridge and tried to pull it down to gain access to London. In that case they failed. And a lot of the so-called Vikings were rent asunder and destroyed and cast down into the watery wastes. If you read the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, you can find out more details about that. But the fact is that lots of Viking weapons ended up at the bottom of the River Thames, a river I know only too well and have waded around in, and have been an archaeologist in myself, actually. Very fascinating. History is constantly coming out of that river. And one of the things that came out was a whole bunch of Dane axes, probably from that attack, because it's where they came out was very close to London Bridge, where London Bridge, the Anglo-Saxon London Bridge, was. So, don't confuse it with Tower Bridge, incidentally. Completely different thing, very different period, very different construction. This was a large wooden bridge, okay? So, a load of Dane axes came out, and they have a variety, and it's absolutely amazing kind of find, because of course we've got several axes from the same date, from the same place. We pretty much know where they've come from and why they were there. And there's variation between them, so it's a great way to compare different ones. Anyway, to cut a long story short, this is a pretty faithful replica of a Dane axe. Now, many of, if I just put this one down for a second, I won't get to the pole axe yet. Many of you will be familiar with lots of other types of axes which are around. If I just grab a random one off my wall, so this is a replica by Wolfland, and this is based on a also Viking era axe found, I think, in the Czech Republic, if I remember correctly, although it could be Poland, I can't remember now. But anyway, basically a Slavic country. So this is a sort of Viking era, Slavic area axe. Now, of course, the Vikings were active all over Europe and beyond, all the way down to the Byzantine Empire, and indeed probably to the Americas. But this is another example of another type of axe, and you'll notice it has a curved blade. And obviously there's bearded axes, and there's all sorts of other, there's axes from other areas, from India, from Persia, that have curved blades on them. Now, finally we get to the pole axe. Now, there are certain types of axe, I won't say these are the only ones in the world, but there are certain types of axe from medieval, late medieval and Renaissance Europe which have straight edges, as you can see here. And anybody who studies pole weapons from the late medieval and Renaissance eras will notice that lots of types of poleaxe and lots of types of halberd have straight edge. Now, not all of them are exactly the same. So this one, the straight edge, and it's not sharp, don't worry, it's in line with the shaft. Okay, so that's one setup whereby the straight edge is in line with the shaft. But that's not the only one. We do actually find poleaxes and halberds where the straight edge is angled like that. Now that's interesting. If we just ignore the difference between straight and curved for a second, We equally find that with the curved axes as well. So sometimes the curve is parallel, shall we say, with the shaft of the axe, okay, and that's true of most Indian and Indo-Persian axes. So in other words, the top and the bottom are equidistant from the line of the shaft, whereas some curved blade axes, we have this forward tilt, as we do on this Dane axe. Now, this gets super interesting. So there's essentially two questions that we're addressing here, and I'm not going to say that I'm necessarily going to give any definitive answers in this video, and actually I invite you to give your thoughts and your theories, your observations, perhaps even from using these things, in the comments down below. But you'll notice that this edge is actually curved forwards. Now, the reason I specifically fixate on Dane axes here, or great axes of the Viking era, is that many of them have this forward tilt like that. We also find that with something like a Francisca, but probably for a different reason. A Francisca is a throwing axe, and actually it aids getting the point into the target. But with this type of handheld axe, because clearly I don't think anybody is going to think that this is a throwing axe. With this type of blade, which is tilted forwards, what's interesting is in the period that these come from, and you can see this in the Museum of London or the River Thames examples, some are like this, some are tilted forward, and some are like this one and parallel. And in fact, there's another example of one of these in the British Museum. It's actually a particularly large and heavy example, quite different actually to the Museum of London examples, which tend to be lighter than the British Museum example. Probably slightly different period, different cultural group. So it probably, I think if I remember correctly, it did also come out of the Thames, but from a different place. So it was probably from a different raid, a different group of Vikings, perhaps 100 years difference in time, maybe 50 years. But you'll notice that in the same period that we get these parallel edges to the shaft, you also get these tilted forwards edges. Now, before we come back to the curved and straight question, let's just consider that, because a lot of people have asked me over the years, why do some late medieval and Renaissance halberds have this tilted forward angle? And what's interesting is we also find that tilted forward angle in early medieval or Viking age axes as well, and even certain even earlier axes if we go all the way back to the Bronze Age. So my answer is this, essentially. It's to do with what you're hitting and the angle you want to hit it at, okay? Now, clearly there isn't one that's necessarily better than the other. It's probably to do with preference. But if we look at wood chopping axes are generally parallel like that. And of course, when we're let's put my great axe down. When we're chopping wood, of course, we're mostly standing parallel to the thing we're hitting and hitting it at perpendicular at 90 degrees. Okay, so we're chopping at 90 degrees, completely kind of parallel to the thing we're hitting. So perhaps it makes sense to have a blade like this. Not saying that no wood chopping axes have this tilt, some of them might do. But when we're hitting a person or a person on a horse, or a person behind a shield, or a person who's trying to block with their weapon, I think there is some advantage to having this tilted forward blade, because of course we're hitting there. Now, if we're hitting someone in the shoulder or head, if you look at the angle, my hands are generally lower than the thing I'm hitting, particularly if I'm hitting downwards. Now, not to say you can't cut upwards with an axe, but I don't think it's very common. We do cut upwards with swords, but even with swords, cutting downwards is more common than cutting upwards. And with an axe, because of the top-heavy nature, just the nature of the weapon, most cuts are going to be downwards, and this is certainly what we see in the treatises as well. Now, if you look at in like a freeze frame, at the moment of me hitting downwards with the axe here, you will notice that the blade, if it's hitting on top of someone's shoulder or head, is now parallel. Okay, so I think it's very much a function of the fact that with a halberd, particularly so with a halberd in fact, because if you're striking over kind of ranks and hitting someone who's in a rear rank like this, if you look at the angle of my axe, it is now at the perfect angle to hit them in the shoulder, neck or head with most of the edge. So I think it's to do with what you're hitting and the way that you're swinging. Okay, we don't probably need to break it down into any more detail than that. So, first thing to say is whether we're looking at the Viking era or whether we're looking at late medieval, we sometimes have parallel blades, we sometimes have forwards blades. You might then ask, well, if this is better, why do some axes have the parallel blade? I don't know, is the short answer. But here's an interesting thing. The Dane axe is a long weapon, okay? The halberd is a long weapon. What we generally find, and this isn't always true because you do find these tilted forward blades on short shafts as well, but generally speaking, it does seem, if we look at the Viking era, for example, parallel blades are on short shafts. They are short axes primarily designed to be used one-handed, which means that they might be coming out in more of a straight line with the arm, for example, round like this, or round like that, or even downwards. Whereas the forwards curved blades tend to be on long shafted axes in the Viking era. And this is also true if we go forwards to the late 15th or 16th centuries with halberds. We see halberd blades tilted forwards, but we tend not to see short horseman's axes. Short horseman's axes tend to be more like that. So there's the nucleus here. I'm not planting my flag firmly in any one of these theories or ideas. I'm really kind of spitballing, and you're very welcome to post your reactions and thoughts below. But at the moment, my current working theory is that for the reason that I've just explained, to do with the way that your hands end up and the position you end up in, with long shafted axes, a tilted blade often makes sense. But here's the elephant in the room is bringing it back to pole axes again. Usually pole axes aren't like that. Usually pole axes, they sometimes are, and there are surviving ones. I think there's one in the Royal Armouries that has a tilted forwards blade, just like a lot of halberds do. But a lot of halberds and a lot of pole axes actually have a parallel blade here. So I don't think that necessarily one is inherently better than the other. It's just that some people thought that one was better than the other, and there was a differing opinion. So by and large, most pole axes, whether they have a curved blade or a straight blade, tend to be parallel to the shaft like this rather than tilted forward, but they are occasionally tilted forward. So now back to the question: curved blade, straight blade, what are the different strengths and weaknesses, and why might they sometimes have chosen one over the other? So first thing to say is, I don't 100% know. There is nothing written about this. Nobody has ever published any book where they categorically state, as far as I've seen anyway, categorically state why straight blade or curved blade. But here are the clear strengths and weaknesses. So with a curved blade, if I just put the straight one down for a second, the reason that most axes have a curved edge is it means that when you impact a target, there is a focal point. Whether it's a person's body or whether it's a large tree trunk, it's pretty much the same situation, because if you have a large flat surface, a curved blade is going to give a penetrating point and then slice away from that. It's a bit how a curved sword blade will impact and then the rest of the blade will draw through. You're getting that in both directions with the curve away from the impact point, and it means that all of the energy from that moment, that instant of penetration, is focused on a smaller point of the edge instead of being spread out over a large flat surface. With a straight blade, if we were hitting a flat object, like a person's torso or side of their head or a tree trunk, the problem is all of the energy is spread out over such a wide surface of the edge of the axe blade that it dissipates the energy and means that you don't have one point of penetration. So you're more likely to get a kind of, put the same total amount of energy into the target, but spread over a larger surface, so you're less likely to penetrate it. So a straight edge should be worse for chopping than a curved edge. And, for this reason, throughout history, most fighting axes, doesn't matter whether you're talking about, a Native American tomahawk or whether you're talking about a Indian battle axe or a Viking axe, have curved edges, okay? And most wood chopping axes have curved edges. So curved edges, I think, by and large, are advantageous. But here's the thing. Against what? Against things that a blade can penetrate, okay? Now, let's just think about the context here. Let's weigh in with a massive, great swinging amount of context, like a wrecking ball, straight into this video. When did straight blades like this really become popular? 15th, 16th century. What do most soldiers wear in the 15th and 16th century? Ta-da! Armour. And I think this is probably the answer, okay? poleaxes and halberds that I have studied very often aren't very sharp. Okay, now this might be shocking to some of you, and it's been somewhat depressing to me because I love the idea of a lovely, great, sharp halberd or poleaxe blade being able to carve through things. But the fact is, if you go into museums and actually you look at halberds and you look at poleaxes, a lot of them don't really have a sharp axe blade. What they actually have is a blade that's more, well, kind of like this, a wedge which comes to an edge, but it's not really sharpened. It's more like, I would say, chisel, but it's not even as sharp as a chisel, because a good chisel should be sharp. You know, it's essentially a fat chisel edge. It's a wedge. Okay, it's more like a splitting axe than a, you know, chopping axe. So I think this is part of it. I think fundamentally is we're comparing apples with oranges. I think the fact is that in the Viking era, this was what most of you out there would think of as an axe. This was a super sharp thing that sharpened up you can shave with and would chop through flesh and horses and meat and branches of trees if needs be, fortifications, really well. This is a chopping implement. And fundamentally, I don't think that most late medieval and Renaissance poleaxes and halberds were really axes. I won't say all of them, but I don't think most of them were axes in the same sense that the Dane axe was, or most other types of axe from history. They were more like in some ways more similar to a warhammer, actually. Okay, they're more like a splitting thing, more like a hitting thing than a cutting and chopping thing. Now, in that context, bearing in mind you're no longer trying to chop through wood or flesh with this, that's not your goal, this now becomes a different type of object, and having a long straight blade has a few advantages. So, if we imagine for a second that you had a beautifully made Dane axe like this from Thor's Forge that I'm modelling here today, if you smash that as hard as you can into this hardened carbon steel sallet made by Peter Polyak, you're going to break a chunk out of this blade, and that's not just hyperbole. I am fairly certain you will lose a chunk out of this blade. The fact is that if these Dane axes, and not to say that, I mean, weapons like this were used, the Sparth axe used by the Garglass were used in this period, but if blades this thin as the classic Dane axe, were used against, and with this edge, were used against plate armour in the 15th and 16th centuries, the edges are going to get mashed up, and they are still going to be effective weapons for hitting really hard with and fighting with in all of the ways you use a poleaxe, but they are no longer going to be really sharp cleaving implements because their edges are going to get utterly destroyed by the hard steel armour and iron armour that they are hitting on a regular basis, which they didn't do in the Anglo-Saxon period. So, bearing that in, oh, and also one important thing about that, not only that, but curved edge. Remember what I said about focal point? That's great when you're chopping flesh, but now if you're hitting a helmet or armour, that focal point now takes a huge amount more damage because it's focused on a small area. Now, one of the great things about having a more robust, less sharp and straight edge is you're not going to take as much damage to this. And this is exactly what this poleaxe is designed for. This is its bread and butter. This is literally what it lives for, what it was born for. It was born to smash helmets as hard as possible and stab into armpits and smash people in the pollaines and hook behind their legs and pull and push and smash and just smash and go crazy around. Yes, I've lost it a bit. The fact is that this was designed almost entirely just to smash armour. So these straight, and that's true of a lot of halberds, not all halberds. But one thing, just to reel it back, one thing I do also want to say is that not all poleaxes have straight edges, okay? A lot of halberds and poleaxes have curved edges, so there was difference of opinion, difference of taste. Some poleaxes and some halberds have blades like this, and some of them were sharp. So, to conclude, I think basically what we're talking about here are different weapons for different priorities, slightly different purposes. Overall, to kill people, okay, to fight. So the same purpose ultimately, but through a different means. Straight-bladed axes like this often were designed for smashing up armour, okay? Curved blades like this were for carving up flesh. And sometimes certain pole axes had more of a choppy, cutty blade on them. Sometimes they had more of a smashy blade on them. And that's also true of halberds. A lot of halberds have more of a, like a meat cleaver blade, more of a slice and dice blade, and some of them have more of a smashy blade. And some of them aren't very sharp at all, and some of them are sharp. So there we go. I think that's kind of the answer. Different axes for different purposes, just the same way as today, someone who is a woodsman will have different axes for different types of work, you know, and they will have different types of blade and different types of edge geometry on them. Some will be for splitting, some will be for just, you know, small work and hand hatchets and stuff like this. Some will be big old double-bitted, chopping down massive trees, you know, different axes for different purposes. And it was the same in medieval warfare. Different axes, different edges, different edge shape, different edge geometry for hitting different targets and fighting in different ways. I hope this has been interesting. As always, and as I've mentioned, you might have things to add in the comments down below. You might even know of period sources which actually talk about this. I have never seen a single one which really talks about poleaxe blades, unfortunately. And in fact, a number of the poleaxe sources don't even barely even mention the axe blade at all. They mostly talk about the hammer and the dag, or spike at the top, and the cue, or tail spike at the back end. But anyway, very interested to hear your comments down below. As always, thanks for watching. If you're not subscribed, please check that you have done. And if you love my channel, if you really love my channel, you'll click that notification bell as well. I hope I see you back on the channel really soon. I have been Matt Easton, and I will continue to be. See you soon, folks. Cheers.